Hello again, my name is Nick, and thanks for joining me in this series, Jesus and the Gospels. In this lesson, we're going to be examining the culture of Jesus and his contemporaries. I don't think I need to state the obvious, but we live in a completely different world than Jesus and his contemporaries. And while I think many realize that, most nonetheless have very little understanding about the first century culture and what that all entailed. In fact, oftentimes we read our Bibles and we'll ask questions like, why were males favored over females? Why were marriages prearranged? Why didn't these people have last names? That's a good one. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus, son of Joseph, Paul of Tarsus, Simon the Zealot, Mary Magdalene, Simon Bar-Jonah, James the Less, on and on it goes. In ancient times, you did not have last names. Rather, your identity was formed by who you were, where you were from, and what people thought of you. Remember in John's Gospel when Philip finds Nathanael? And Philip says to Nathanael, "We found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth." Nathanael responds by saying, "Jesus of Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Or remember when Jesus arrives with his disciples in Caesarea Philippi and he says, "Who do people say that I am?" Do you think that Jesus was having what we would call a modern-day identity crisis? No. Jesus wanted to get a sense of what people thought of him and what they were saying. These are important little McNuggets, if you will, that will help us better understand Jesus and his contemporaries. Because the past is like a foreign world to us when we stop to think about it. And I would argue that familiarizing ourselves with Jesus' culture is as important, if not more important, than our previous study on the history leading up to Jesus' time. So again, the better we understand these things, the better we're going to understand the context of the New Testament and the Gospels. The family. In Jesus' world, the family was the basic social unit. But within this family, there was a hierarchy. Families were patriarchal, meaning the man or the father was the highest authority. The man was the one who represented the family's public face or honor. He was the breadwinner. He arranged his daughter's marriage, and he was responsible for property and transactions. The patriarch also reserved the right to divorce his wife. Unfortunately, not the other way around. Women in the ancient world. The women of households gained honor in the community from doing what? Childbearing, and in general, running the home while the father was at work. And if a woman could not bear children, then this brought much shame upon the woman, because children were viewed as gifts from God. Sadly, women were also viewed as second-class citizens who had virtually no authority or say in matters. So if a woman's husband were to die, she could be in a lot of trouble. In many cases, if she was barren with no children, she would be as good as dead unless she could quickly find another husband. Now, there were safety nets put in place according to certain Old Testament passages to protect widows, but this was a man's world. Also, when we think about the education or religious roles, women were again neglected. Most women could not read or write and were strictly forbidden to hold any priestly positions within Judaism. However, Roman laws and other religions such as the Artemisius cult permitted women priestesses. What's interesting is that Jesus utterly transformed the way women were viewed both socially and religiously. Jesus had women disciples. Prior to Jesus introducing this, there is zero extant evidence anywhere of women disciples within Judaism. Children. Boys were, as I pointed out in the beginning, favored over women. But why? Well, a male son would be able to carry the family name into the next generation, and he would be able to provide power to the family. Of course, Jewish boys were circumcised on the 8th day, and these boys would more often than not have access to some form of education in the synagogue, and they would also be educated in the same trade that their father was in. So Jesus was, as we're told in the Gospels, some form of a carpenter. Now the Greek word is tekton, which can mean a number of different things ranging from a toolmaker to a carpenter. What's interesting is in the 2nd century, an individual by the name of Justin, while visiting Israel, was supposedly shown plows that Jesus himself had made that were still in use during that time. Now, this isn't exactly relevant specifically to the Gospels, but St. Paul was a tent maker, which was surely something his father would have taught him in order to make a living. Work and trade. What did people do to make ends meet in the 1st century? Well, farmers were the most abundant and worked from sunup until sundown. There were also craftsmen or artisans, and they worked almost as long. Now, if you were well off, you worked much shorter hours. An example of that would be, you got up early and you worked until noon, you ate a meal, and you took a siesta for the rest of the day. Kind of a nice life if you're wealthy. But you have to remember, and this is a very important point to underscore, almost everyone in antiquity was poor. Today we have what is known as the middle class, although that's dwindling quickly. But that was non-existent during Jesus' day. As I said, you were either one of two things, rich or poor. Now the poorest people, not slaves, but those who were dead broke, were hired in the marketplace to work the fields. We see an example of this in Matthew 20 verses 1 through 16, where Jesus talks about giving these day workers a job and paying them a day's wage, or a denarii, and that provided them with food for the day. You remember the Lord's Prayer? Give us this day our daily bread. Well, in antiquity, it meant just that. Lord, please provide us the means to get by for the day, and we'll worry about tomorrow later. Fishing was also common, particularly by the Sea of Galilee, and fish were a staple of many people's diets there. How do you think people fished, though? They had nets. There were a variety of different kinds of nets. Some of them were supported by floats that were on top of the water and weights on the bottom for night fishing. For example, Luke 5:2, or in deep water they were used. During the day, however, they used round casting nets. We see examples of this in Mark 1:16, and they also had drag nets towed along between two boats, Matthew 13:47. Now in antiquity, during the time of Jesus, farmers grew mainly wheat and barley in the fields. Now here's something interesting. What do farmers do today to the soil before they plant seeds? They plow it or till the soil, right? Well, in Jesus' day, they planted first and then they tilled. In fact, they sort of just grabbed the seed and scattered it everywhere. And then they tilled, and this is significant for us. Maybe we can extract some quick application. Now, we're not going to study the parable in Mark chapter 4, so we shouldn't look at certain soils or people in a specific way when we have evangelistic opportunities, should we? Rather, we should scatter God's seed everywhere we go, because God's word does not return void. Isaiah 55:10 through 11. Honor and shame. This is perhaps the most important part of this lesson. Almost all Eastern and Near Eastern cultures were honor-shame cultures, and this is really important when we understand Jesus' world. What do you think the greatest fear Americans have today? I mean, we spend billions of dollars on this. Life. We don't want to die. I mean, we have cliches like, well, it's not a matter of life and death. That is a telltale sign that our top priority is to preserve life and avoid death. I mean, think of COVID-19 and everything going on with that, how scared people are. Now contrast that with Jesus' world. For these people, life wasn't that important, but honor was. In fact, life wasn't even worth living if you had to live with guilt and shame. Now here's an interesting little side note. Social historians recognize that in cultures that lose their sense of honor, also lose their sense of shame. I mean, think of it, embezzling money, cheating on taxes, respect for elders. How true are those things and many others in our epoch of time? Think of Judas Iscariot. What did Judas do after he betrayed Jesus? He took his own life, probably because he was so deeply ashamed of what he did. So to Judas, taking his own life was better than living a life of public shame. In Luke 14:8-9, we read of a man who takes an honored seat at a banquet and then is asked to move to a lower one. In this instance, he is publicly shamed before his colleagues, almost beyond death. Honor meant everything to the ancients. Think about crucifixion or death on a Roman cross. This was the most humiliating way to die or to be shamed. Yes, crucifixion was extremely painful, but it was also meant to publicly humiliate and shame the individual. In fact, most people that were crucified were done so on a public highway, and they were naked, left to die. They weren't given a proper burial. And this is important because even where you were buried was important to those in antiquity. So someone committing sedition or treason and was crucified was not given a proper burial. Their honor had been stripped from them. There are a number of places in the New Testament where people's honor is challenged. In the Gospels, we read that at a dinner party, Herod Antipas is so pleased with his wife Herodias' daughter Salome and her dancing that he promises to grant any request for her, up to half of his kingdom. What does she ask for? The head of John the Baptist, Mark 6:26, which says, "The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he wanted to preserve his honor. He did not want to refuse her." Obviously, Herod did not want to do this according to Mark 6:20, because there we read, Herod feared John and protected him, knowing that he was a righteous man. In the Gospels, we also see that Jesus' own honor is challenged several times by the scribes and the Pharisees. In one specific instance, it is asked of Jesus by those challenging his authority, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" Well, it was sort of a trap, because if Jesus says yes, then he goes against the people. If he says no, then he goes against Rome. So there's a false dilemma that's set up here, and Jesus handles it perfectly, preserving his honor by saying, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God's." Jesus kept his honor intact. So how did people actually gain honor? In our world, we associate honor with wealth and power as true symbols of success. In Jesus' world, the greatest achievements were gaining honor. In this slide on gaining honor, I'm not actually going to be exegeting the biblical passages here, but I just want to take a moment to reinforce what it meant and what it was like to gain honor in antiquity. Well, there are three examples in the Gospels that, like I stated, I just want to briefly touch on. In the previous slide, I mentioned Matthew 22:15-22, where Jesus is given a false dilemma on paying taxes. Should we give them to Caesar or should we give them to God? And Jesus answers phenomenally when he says, "Give to God what is God's and give to Caesar what is Caesar's." And when they heard this, they were amazed. Likewise, in Matthew 22, the exact same chapter, verses 23-33, we have a little discussion about marriage at the resurrection. Now again, when the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. The teachers of the law were attempting to humiliate Jesus and strip him from his honor. Obviously, they were unsuccessful at doing, and Jesus retained or gained his honor while in Jerusalem. And lastly, in Matthew 22, again, verses 34-40, we see in this cluster of challenges to strip Jesus from his honor that Jesus talks about the greatest commandment. And again, he's challenged, what is the greatest commandment? Well, of course, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And at this, Matthew tells us no one could say a word in reply. Food and meals. You know, today, you and I live in an age of unlimited goods. We have sayings like, eat all you want, we'll make more. We are so disconnected at times from the land where food grows and the facts about food that we think food comes from grocery stores and that it'll always be on the shelves. But this was a tough world. When Jesus prayed, "Give us this day our daily bread," what do you think he meant? He was asking for the Father's sustaining hand to provide them with food necessary for survival. In fact, the only way some people survived was to beg, borrow, or steal. Famines, when they occurred, wreaked havoc and chaos on communities and countries because everyone depended on a good crop. But as Americans, we can't comprehend running out of food because it's everywhere. Part of the reason for the lack of food in antiquity also had to do with Rome, or the elite. They made up about 2% of the population, and they controlled 98% of the wealth. Now I will say this, Roman citizens by and large generally ate well. They would eat 4 squares a day, consisting of lots of meats, vegetables, and fruits. But a Jew ate no more than 2 meals a day, one at noon and another in the evening, and their diet consisted of nearly 0 meats, only on special holidays. Otherwise, it was fruit, nuts, breads, or dates. Oh, and they didn't have sugar, at least not the way we think of it. If they wanted to sweeten something, they used honey. And also, water was unsafe, so it was very common until actually only a few hundred years ago to mix water and wine, 3 to 4 parts water. But meals were very important in this context as well. For most people, the workday ended at dark, and then they would sit and eat together as a family with friends. They would sprawl out on the floor and lay on their side and enjoy a meal. Remember, there was nothing for them to do after dark, so they would eat and socialize for hours. What sort of clothing and style was in during the first century? Well, men wore knee-length tunics. Women also wore tunics with an outer robe extending to the feet, and most people wore sandals, but oftentimes the poor went barefoot. So, because the roads were dusty and dirty, when you entered someone's home, a slave would greet you, remove your sandals, and wash your feet. This is interesting because John the Baptist says that he was unfit to untie the Messiah's sandals, speaking of how much lower his status was in comparison with Jesus's. Interestingly enough, it's Jesus who washes the disciples' feet in John chapter 13, demonstrating his willingness to become a slave for his creation. You know, there's much more we could discuss, things such as entertainment and hospitality, but I think we provided a solid base to better help us understand the culture during Jesus' day.